lack of appropriate background has certainly allowed certain extraordinary claims to be made and on the whole believed. And this is because there exists very little in the way of checks and balances that enable the historian or the general reader to make educated judgments. And this is why this book begins with an extensive introduction, all the while attempting to build the subject from the ground up. So the introduction includes reasoning behind the study, which is kind of broadly what I've just outlined. The second is related to how men were sucked into the army, or in other words, how they were in a position to become POWs at all. It outlines the high politics of peacetime and wartime conscription, but also paints a picture of how ordinary citizens made the transition into military life. The central theme of the book dictates that part of this section deals with what it was like to enlist in the British Army as a Jew. Anglo-Jews had to endure certain tribulations, but by and large their experience was positive enough for them to look back on their time in the services with satisfaction and pride. On the other hand, so-called enemy aliens who volunteered for military service had a harder time gaining acceptance. Their journeys also explored. The third fundamental element to the introduction concerns what life was like behind the wire. Now, the lot of the POW wasn't one to be envied. Contrary to popular accounts, things like, The Great Escape and Colditz and things like that, the experience was generally one of disenfranchisement from the war effort, of debilitation and depression. Instead of involvement in a great cause, POWs were confronted with a shrunken world in which the seemingly inconsequential took shape as the most important. It wasn't a world populated necessarily by heroes, or at least how most people think of heroes, but by real men struggling to come to terms with an extended period of humiliation at the hands of the enemy. So, life as a POW was largely miserable, an empty, exhausting, attenuating experience that depleted the body and sapped the soul. However, the very nature of camp life, the long days, the incessant boredom and mindless work made men hungry for information. This, and living in such close proximity to each other, such that privacy was a thing of the past, meant that news travelled fast. Fresh arrivals, transferees, returnees and escapees were all plugged for information. The information they brought was eagerly sucked up and passed around. And this desire for news informed a lively chatter culture that pervaded the POW population. The latest information about atrocities of all kinds set the wires humming. It was devoured, told, and then retold, cutting through the Nazi regime's desire for secrecy. But British detainees did not just see and hear about the violence at the heart of Nazism. After all, many were present when Jews were transported, humiliated, starved, brutalised and murdered. These Britons also broadly understood that Jews were the primary focus of Nazi rage, for no other reason than they were Jews. And the first chapter details just how much of the Holocaust British POWs witnessed. Excuse me. POWs captured in the early part of the war were first confronted with atrocities against Poles. The testimony of Royal Engineer D.C. Mason, for example, demonstrates just how shattering and confusing they found their first confrontation with reports of extreme violence. Mason was based at Lansdorf in Upper Silesia. I think I have a slide of it. There it is. Lansdorf is now called Lambinowitz, up in the top left-hand corner there. Auschwitz, or Auschwitz, is down here in the bottom right-hand corner as we look at it. But the network of camps POW camps, that is, that stretched through this area was vast. There were over 600 separate work detachments. So, Mason was based at Lansdorf, while others, for example, found themselves imprisoned near Poznan, where they witnessed the steady but rapid deterioration in the treatment of Polish Jews. A minority of POWs even managed to escape from working parties. One of these was Richard Pape, a tough sergeant navigator from Yorkshire who made his way to the small Polish town of Czestochowa, 60 miles north of Auschwitz, latterly made infamous in Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Here he witnessed the dreadful treatment of the town's Jewish remnant. Others, while in the process of being moved from one camp to another, witnessed for themselves the terrible scenes accompanying the transport of Jews to Auschwitz. The popular conception of Auschwitz is of one camp, normally Birkenau, whereas in reality, as you probably all know, Auschwitz was a system of camps spread over a wide area of Upper Silesia. Also in Upper Silesia was Lansdorf, which I've previously mentioned, the largest POW camp in German-controlled territory, which is something to think about. For the majority of Britons, though, Lansdorf was only a base camp. The majority were farmed out to those smaller work camps throughout the surrounding area. And here they worked cheek by jowl with Jewish slave labourers at places such as Monowitz, Auschwitz III, Libiatz, Jaworzno, Heidebreck and Bleckhammer. POWs saw firsthand the murderous anti-Jewish policies of the German occupiers in action. They saw starved and dilapidated Jewish slave labourers carted off to the gas chambers. Those who didn't see it for themselves heard about it from their colleagues. As one of them said, talk about the gas chambers was as common as regular dinner conversation. POWs were informed about the abomination that constituted selections. Some saw for themselves stationary cattle trucks full of Jews standing outside Auschwitz waiting to be processed. They also witnessed for themselves the dreadful conditions of forced marches at the end of the war. So that's all in Chapter 1. Chapter 2 deals with the place that witnessed the most prevalent interaction between Britons and Jews inside the POW camp itself. Jewish military service was beset with dilemmas. One of the first was whether to hide or retain one's Jewish identity once captured. Most decided to keep it, and as a consequence were at risk of exposure to the dangerous vagaries of an enemy that had institutionalised anti-Semitism. The British government was forced to intervene when news leaked out of German attempts to treat Jewish prisoners differently from the rest. In addition, Nazi lawyers attempted to deprive Jews who had fled Europe in the years preceding the war and who had subsequently joined the Allied forces of their rights under the Geneva Convention. British representations through black market diplomacy, which is kind of through third, fourth and fifth parties, stopped momentum building behind these moves, thus saving many Jewish prisoners from a potentially worse fate. The third chapter shows that being Jewish and a POW counted in a number of significant ways. Fear of capture by German forces, each of whom, bear in mind, had sworn a personal oath of allegiance to a rabidly anti-Semitic leader, was just the beginning of the ordeal. Knowing that they were earmarked and a sitting target, the separation of many from the main body of POWs after capture must have seemed like the consummation of pre-captive anxieties. Targeted outbursts of violence by guards or German officials straining at the leash for a more draconian anti-Jewish policy did little to help. The perceived usefulness of Jews to both captors and captives, mostly actually because of multilingual abilities, perhaps acted as a respite, but it was a dubious blessing. The petty jealousies of fellow POWs could bring to the fore anti-Semitic prejudices that had thus far lain dormant. In fact, as well as enduring the same privations as others, Jewish POWs could be forced to act to a more stringent standard in order to prevent the onset of familiar bigotry and possible segregation. That said, there were striking examples of friendship and comradeship between British and Jewish POWs, and post-war accounts testify to these. Ultimately, Jewish POWs, whether British or Palestinian in origin, benefited from the protection of the Geneva Convention, the protestations of British officials, and the brave stand made by particular men of confidence. Now, two of these in particular deserve a mention. One of them, the guy on the left there as we look, was Sidney Sheriff. He was the man of confidence at Lansdorf and in the words of one of his charges, had the most unenviable job in Germany. Obviously it wasn't in Germany, it was in occupied Poland. But while maintaining his dignity and personal smartness, in the words of another witness, he acted as a sort of shock absorber between the Germans and the prisoners, adding, "There are a number of men alive today who owe their continued existence to our SM Sheriff." He also made a brave stand when it came to threats against the Jewish element in Lansdorf itself. The threat was made that Red Cross parcels wouldn't be passed on to the Jewish POWs, and Sheriff made the stand against the German authorities and said that if you don't give it to the Jewish inmates, or you don't give the parcels to the Jewish inmates, then the British won't accept them either. And so therefore he created a dilemma for the German authorities, who had to give in, because on the other side, or rather, what the Germans, or rather the Nazis, understood was that the British had German POWs in their hands as well, and so there was always the possibility that the British could, introduce their own strictures on German prisoners. The other one who deserves an honorary mention is James Dixie Deans. He's on the right-hand side there. He's over to the left-hand side of the photograph, talking to a couple of German generals, German officials, German generals, I think they are. German authorities at Stalag Luft 6, or Heidekrug, attempted to segregate Jewish prisoners from the rest. One of Dean's team, responsible for organising morning parade, was ordered by the camp authorities to ensure that Jews were to parade separately and to be segregated in a single barracks. He refused to comply, prompting German anger. At that moment, and here I quote, "A greatly incensed Jimmy Deans arrived. In clipped German, he outshouted them all. The order, he told them forcefully, would not be passed on. He sharply pointed out that the prisoners were members of the King's service, and it was one of the rules of that service that the faith of all denominations should be respected, even bloody tree worshippers." And the Germans gave in. So these two men deserve something in the way of recognition. This chapter also shows that when Jewish POWs worked with or stumbled across Jewish slave labourers, they were tormented by quandaries. How could they help those so patently suffering such terrible depredations? A shared Jewish heritage wasn't enough to overcome a set of obstacles placed in the way by the stifling opposition of German anti-Semitic policies. The response of Jewish POWs to the suffering of fellow Jews provides a kind of counterpoint and helps to gauge British reactions to the same thing. And these are explored in Chapter 4. British nationals were held at one time or another at Buchenwald, Natzweiler, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, Dachau, Majdanek, Theresienstadt, as well as the environs of Auschwitz. The book concentrates upon three of these. In the summer of 1944, 168 airmen sorry, I think, oh no, we'll go to that one in a minute. 168 Allied airmen were plunged into the despicable regime at Buchenwald. Stripped of their rights, they became not mere observers, but recipients of Nazi cruelty. Their experience helps us to understand how integrated the German camp system was. Buchenwald and Auschwitz formed a kind of symbiosis. What ordinary British servicemen experienced, strangely enough, helps to expose the interconnectedness of Western and Eastern camps. Mostly, however, this chapter focuses on the experiences and thoughts of two incarcerated agents from the Special Operations Executive. That's when the next slide comes in. These men provide evidence that illuminate the limits of British influence and compassion, respectively, as well as providing crucial insights into concentration camp life. Given their specific background and training, these individuals were imbued with a particular form of mental toughness and adaptability. If anyone was equipped to help stricken inmates, they were. The experiences of these hardy agents provide a useful comparative template for what was possible to achieve in such difficult circumstances, thus testing the assertions of some modern academics who claim or imply that the presence of Britons acted as a guarantor of humanitarian values in the face of the Nazi menace. The testimony of recognised war hero Forrest Yeo Thomas, he's the fella on the left with his pipe looking properly like a British officer, reveals the constraints under which he had to operate. His training, skills and resourcefulness could not, in the camp environment, translate into meaningful opposition to the outworking of Nazism. He was entirely unable to influence what was happening to Jewish inmates. He was a man not without compassion for the suffering of Jews, but in reality, all he could do was to prevent his own demise. The other SOE agent was Christopher Burney. That's this fella here. Now, Burney was a remarkably astute and intelligent observer of camp life. And if you get the chance, I'm sure they've got it here in the library. It's his book, written in 1945, is called The Dungeon Democracy, and it's worth a read. Because for an account written so soon after his incarceration, and without the benefit of a well-developed Holocaust, the well-developed body of Holocaust knowledge now available, his level of perceptiveness was actually quite astonishing. What becomes clear, though, is that his judgment of Jews sat at odds with his generally humanitarian outlook. He witnessed deep suffering at close quarters, perceived and described camp power structures, and saw the effects of fragmentation on the camp population. He understood the importance of the aim of death through work and revealed that Auschwitz and its function was common everyday knowledge. That's in Buchenwald. He also saw that Jews were at the centre of it all, that they were the principal target, the main object of German policy and general hatred. Yet all this couldn't shift the deep sense of personal antipathy he felt for Jews. Burney not only broadly understood what he saw, his contorted attempt to justify barely contained anti-Jewish loathing shows that he was contaminated by the upturned morality of the camp, but still retained what Primo Levi called a moral armature. Like I say, I would encourage you to read the book. It's only a short book, but it's worth a read. Well, this chapter then explores the experience of British and Jewish POWs who found themselves incarcerated in Theresienstadt, or to be more precise, the dreaded small fortress which stood on the other bank of the Our River. Allied personnel started arriving there in the autumn of 1944, and by the following spring there were nearly 200 men held in the dark, damp cells and subterranean casements. While there, life was bad enough, but their hardships paled in comparison to the Jewish inmates who died daily before their eyes. This chapter uses diaries and post-war legal documents to shed light on the world behind the walls of a place that has been called a way station to death. The next section of the third chapter, sorry, it's not the third chapter, this is the fourth chapter, I think, dealing with POW reactions to the plight of stricken Jews, concerns those who found themselves in the environs of Auschwitz. After examining testimony from the wider Auschwitz area, this part of the book focuses on British POWs based with the E715 detachment. Right, this is kind of where it is. Over here you have a rudimentary map of the Auschwitz area, where you can see Birkenau over on the left, Auschwitz II. You can see Auschwitz I in yellow, just this side of the railway tracks, and you can see IG Farben, the massive IG Farben there, and you can see Auschwitz III Monowitz just on the edge there. This is another map that shows Farben itself, and you can see at the bottom right-hand corner there is Monowitz, which is the concentration camp, and the British POWs were held in two camps that you can see on the map. The first, I'm not tall enough, but it's Camp 6, the one that's kind of like at a 45-degree angle there. That's the first camp they were held in, and they started moving there sometime in September 1943. And then in June 1944 they were moved, or rather a remnant of them were moved over to Camp 8 there, which, as you can see, is just over half a kilometre away from Monowitz. So, and I think we've also got, those are, we've got aerial photos as well. So there we've got Monowitz. You can see over there, I don't know if I can, is this long enough? I don't know. Yeah, okay. Monowitz is just there, and if you look very, very closely, you can see the POW camp just down the road, well, say just about just over half a kilometre away, and that's just an aerial photograph of Monowitz there. So, now this particular work party, like I say, it's the E715 work detachment. That name doesn't apply to the camp itself that they were in. That applies to the number of the work detachment. This particular work party was based just outside the massive IG Farben chemical plant, constructed partly to make the most of slave labour in the area. As such, the POW camp, as I've said, was just over half a kilometre from Monowitz, which at its peak population held 30,000 inmates, mostly Jews. Britons therefore rubbed shoulders with Jewish slave labourers on a daily basis. Some were genuinely moved by what they saw, and sometimes attempted to hand over food and cigarettes. However, these essentially humanitarian acts involved massive risks. Not for the giver so much, but for the recipient. If caught, the Jewish inmate could suffer severe injury or death. It's been claimed that such acts are proof that Britons provided an altruistic counterweight to the Nazi system, as I said earlier on. However, such an assumption, I argue, in the book, is too simplistic. Because my book shows that the warped system, well, I believe it shows, that the warped system and inverted values that presided over slave labourers skewed attempts at humanitarianism. Certain testimonies reveal that Britons were only philanthropic when they felt they could afford it. Moreover, Jewish slave labourers were subject to casual British anti-Semitism. Evidence suggests that even an innocuous brush-off could weigh heavily on the shoulders of a Jewish inmate struggling to survive. So to characterise anti-Semitism among British POWs as kind of anemic and opposed to the more extreme strands, as some other Holocaust scholars perhaps do, is to miss out on the damage such prejudices can have, or could have, in the camp environment. And we're back to the book. The final section of this chapter concerns itself with the forced marches towards the end of the war, or death marches for Jews, certainly. As in the other cases, the line between bystander and participant is blurred. British POWs experienced severe privations, and some even lost their lives on these desperate wanderings from east to west. Nonetheless, moving testimony reveals that Britons recognised the disparity between the experiences of POWs and the remnant of camp survivors. Even here, though, it seems that compassion for Jews was somehow mitigated, and again, I outline how I reached that conclusion in the book. Right, I'll give your ears a rest. Enjoy it, because it's not going to last long. In order to gain some perspective on the way in which British POWs interacted with others in the slave labour environment, the next relatively short chapter concerns itself with how Britons saw their Russian counterparts and how they viewed their German captors. Evidence suggests that there existed a sense of alignment between British and Russian POWs. The warped system and inverted human values that presided over camp existence certainly distorted attempts at altruism. However, Britons appeared to have had less of an ideological or prejudicial barrier when helping Russians as opposed to aiding Jews. And that's on a general basis, not necessarily on specific basis. With regard to German guards and civilian workers, Britons displayed and continued ambivalence. Even when evidence of the campaign of Jewish extermination became common knowledge, POWs simply could not agree on who was to blame. Was it a small clique of Nazis, or should ordinary Germans, so-called ordinary Germans, take their share? Britons generally tended to regard Germans with a degree of indulgence. There was a striking tenacity of faith in the human qualities of the so-called ordinary German that was not necessarily afforded to Jews. All in all, the first half of the book, or probably first 3/5 of the book, concludes that British POW reactions to the plight of Jews under Nazism were complex, being based on a number of factors. These included their own experience, their intrinsic values, how they regarded Jews, whether POWs or inmates, the camp and work environment, and how they regarded others, such as Russians or Germans. Broadly speaking, what they saw shocked their liberal sensibilities, which in turn also helped them to see that what they were witnessing was just plain wrong. However, that same liberal base arguably facilitated a range of responses to the Jewish plight, from outrage at their treatment to outright hostility towards the victims. Nonetheless, whatever the intrinsic values of British POWs, they weren't enough to overcome or even dent the crescendo of violence that characterized the heart of Nazism. Moreover, POWs were sucked into that unresolved, problematical, and perplexing matrix that created by the transposed values of the Nazi worldview. They were sufficiently removed from its epicenter to hold on to their understanding of the difference between right and wrong, but they were also sullied by their interaction with it. So I argue that traditional concepts of heroism and gallantry, cowardice and timidity are therefore insufficient to explain the reactions and behaviour of POWs faced with such overwhelming and unprecedented circumstances. It's therefore imperative that the claims of individual POWs, which have proved so popular and therefore created a rather skewed view of the interaction of British POWs with aspects of the Holocaust, are treated with an appropriate degree of scepticism and investigated with historical rigour. Right, so it then moves on to dealing with people that you've probably heard of. All of the above creates the much needed context for assessing the claims of Charles Coward and Denis Avey. By placing evidence related to these two individuals in context, and by forensically examining their claims against the historical evidence, it becomes clear that their accounts were less than accurate. Using historical evidence written by Coward himself, it's possible to piece together how his story grew from one that was unremarkable to a change of daring do that stretches credibility perhaps to beyond breaking point. His POW repatriation form, completed in the spring of 1945, suggests that Coward attempted 3 times to escape. Yeah, I'm not up to the slides yet, so we're okay. A letter written by him in September expands the story and dramatically starts to resemble some of the heroic war stories already circulated at the time. He claimed to have sabotaged a trainload of V-1 flying bombs, witnessed German troops experimenting with an atom bomb, or what sounds like an atom bomb, and to have escaped from the E715 work detachment, which we saw on the map, with 2 Jews in tow. In 1947, Coward was a witness at the trial of IG Farben Management. His affidavit and testimony brought in new feats of daring, including sending secret coded messages to the War Office about the murder of Jews in Auschwitz, swapping places with an inmate of Monowitz and spending the night there. Those familiar with Dennis Avery's claims will recognise that one. That he was instrumental in smuggling arms and ammunition into Birkenau for the Sonderkommando uprising of October 1944. And finally, he claims to have facilitated the escape of 400 Jews by swapping dead bodies for live ones by bribing a guard with cigarettes. After the publication of The Password is Courage, when all this was brought together, albeit missing out some of his previous contradictory statements, Coward found another way to burnish, that particular heroic image. The fruits of this are to be found, strangely enough, in the autobiography of none other than Shimon Peres, the former president of Israel, where we learn that contrary to all the claims made so far, Coward spent time in Greece saving the life of Peres' father, Yitzhak Persky, who later changed his name to Gershom Peres when he got to Palestine. Now, for all of this, Coward had a film made of his book. The Password is Courage. There's a more modern version of the book. This is on the right is the film poster, which had I'm trying to remember. Oh, Dirk Bogarde. There he is. Yeah, he was a very popular actor at the time. I can remember him. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, you can tell I'm from the 70s. You can tell by my hair. You probably won't recognize. But he was a good-looking and top-notch actor who was at the top of his trade at the time when he starred in this particular flick. He had a whole episode of This Is Your Life dedicated to his exploits. This is a screenshot from a website called The Big Red Book. That was in 1960. And he was inducted into the Righteous Among the Nations. That's a screenshot from the website that I took the other day. As you can see, all the details are there. He escaped from captivity several times, recaptured, and eventually interned in Monowitz camp near Auschwitz, which isn't quite true. During this time, he became known as the Count of Auschwitz. Coward had the idea of collecting precious chocolate and cigarettes from his fellow British prisoners and exchanging them with Auschwitz guards for dead bodies. So it's all there, some of the main claims there on the Yad Vashem website. Latterly, he's had a blue plaque. Oh, sorry, there he is at the Yad Vashem. That's Charles Coward giving a talk there. That's Charles Coward planting his tree on the Avenue of the Righteous, and here's the plaque with his name on. He's had a blue plaque installed on the Edmonton house where he lived, and had a ward named after him at the North Middlesex University Hospital. And he's also been included in Martin Gilbert's book, The Righteous, The Unsung Heroes of the Holocaust, as well as Lynn Smith's book, Heroes of the Holocaust. And there they are. So he makes an appearance in those as well. So to top it all, he was posthumously awarded with the British Hero of the Holocaust Medal by the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown. The problem with all this is that the story Coward told about himself doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. The tendency among modern day commentators is to kind of cherry pick elements of Coward's narrative and claim that these are true, even if they acknowledge that some of his other claims are false. I think the fallacy of that kind of endeavour is fairly self-evident. If Coward claimed that all this was true, and he did stand by those claims, then there's clearly a problem with the overall integrity of the story. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through Coward's individual claims, which after all were highly convoluted. But there are doubtless other details that I haven't uncovered, that could be uncovered, and they're, because it's, like I say, it's a tricky area to unpick, but I did my best. Moving now to Denis Avey. Avey's story owes a large debt to Coward's inventiveness, but his debt was never acknowledged. The different versions of Avey's story, together with the known historical record, reveal too many inconsistencies again for it to be taken at face value. With regard to Avey, I carried out a similar procedure to that of Coward, examining his claims against each other and against the historical record. Avey's claims gave me the opportunity to examine, actually, the minutiae of camp life. He made some fairly bold claims based on what most people understand about the Holocaust, and this helped to make his story kind of more believable. But the details of camp life were often different and in many ways more excruciating than perhaps I'm not talking about you guys here, but than is more commonly understood. The everyday details of camp life, they kind of expose Avey's ignorance. For example, the doling out of food in Monowitz was predicated on each inmate promptly showing the tattooed number on his arm. Yet Avey claimed to have queued up and been given food along with the rest of the inmates. But the Briton wasn't just caught out in detail. He was also prone to tell some larger fibs. For example, or whether it's fibs or whether he convinced himself is very difficult to say. For example, he was interviewed for Demid Jeffries' book Hell's Cartel, which is a book about IG Farben, and he told the author that he had been traumatised by seeing queues of women and children file past the POW camp on their way to the gas chambers. Now, this simply couldn't be true because, as you saw on the map, the POW camp housing E715 was right next to Monowitz, which is about 3 kilometres away from Birkenau, and therefore 3 kilometres away from where everybody was queuing up for the gas chambers. So it's difficult to know why he said these kind of things. He also claimed that the person he swapped with to get into Monowitz, or Birkenau, depending on which version you take as true, told him of an Australian POW who was stoking the crematoria. And he kind of triumphantly told his interviewer on that occasion that he'd tracked down a book written by this guy, and it was kind of presented as proof that Avey was telling the truth about it. But unfortunately for Avey, the book Stoker, by a fellow named Donald Watt, who's an Australian guy, has since been convincingly discredited as a fraud. These are just some examples, and the others are laid out in the book. Now, Avey also has received plaudits from all directions, but he's also had his fair share of doubters. Apart from the plethora of inconsistencies and inaccuracies in Avey's account, perhaps the most damning evidence, although, there's a lot of that, is the extent to which the story mirrors that of Coward. Avey, an anonymous ex-member of the E715 work detachment until the turn of the century, was revealed as a man very much in Coward's image, a loose cannon, a mischief maker, a singular agitator bent on becoming a spanner in the works of the Nazi machine, the self-deprecatory hero unequivocally on the side of the Jews. Other elements that echo Coward's story include interrogations at the hands of sadistic Nazis, involvement in sabotage, and being present at dramatic moments. The claims that Avey communicated with his family in England using an amateur code, that he put himself at risk for the sake of Jewish inmates, that he saw a transport of Jews marching to Birkenau, which I've just talked about, although this was left out of the book, and most importantly that he spent time in Monowitz, although this was changed from an earlier claim that he'd been inside Birkenau, were all present in Coward's account. Now, this last attestation that he broke into Auschwitz involved a ruse that more or less exactly mirrors that of Coward, swapping clothes with an inmate at the end of the working day, spending the night in Monowitz, bribing a guard or capper with cigarettes, and having help from the inside. All these elements are clearly present in Coward's narrative, and yet for AV, Coward was a con man, as he told his interviewer at the Imperial War Museum. Or in The Man Who Broke into Auschwitz, the book itself, Coward's completely ignored. He's left out. The fact is that the success story of the success of Coward's story, I think this is the important part, and this is what I was driving at in the book. The success of Coward's story, that it's remained largely unchallenged, somehow generated a common and long-standing belief that a resourceful individual and a degree of British guile was all that was needed to puncture the epicenter of the final solution. And AV's success, whether acknowledged by him or not, was built on this rather distorted foundation. Yet, the various stories told by Coward and AV undoubtedly struck a chord in Britain and possibly around the world. They resonate because they present tales that people in Britain, generally want to believe. I mean, I'd like to look at the Great Escape and believe that everything that happened in the film happened in reality. I want to see that motorbike, going over the barbed wire. But we know it didn't kind of work that way. It remains to be seen, when faced with overwhelming evidence that the accounts of both are fundamentally flawed, whether this desire to accommodate them remains. Surely claims to heroic status in the context of the mass murder of European Jews should be subject to rigorous historical inquiry. Otherwise, they have the potential, as in the case of AV, to provide fodder for the odious pseudo-theories of Holocaust deniers. When I first started this, I Googled Dennis Avey, and Google gave me 10 results on the first page, and 4 of them were from Holocaust denier sites. I think that's problematic, obviously. After all, false claims of heroism, in the end, do little more than undermine those who already suffered and those who made genuine sacrifices and whose actions and often whose names we'll probably never know. Now, you'll be relieved to hear that I'm coming to the final paragraph. So take a deep breath, and here we go. The book closes with a coda entitled Witnessing the Aftermath. This tells the story of Cyril Rofe, an Anglo-Jewish POW who escaped from a work camp in Upper Silesia and fled eastwards towards the Russian lines. He spent an extended period in the small town of Grodzisko-Dolny, in the heart of the so-called bloodlands of eastern Poland. Here, Rofe learned of the fate of the 600-strong local pre-war Jewish community. By the time he arrived, there were only 19 Jews left. Rofe constructed for himself a picture of, and this is a quote, a picture of the hell Poland had been and still was for her remaining Jews, of the years of persecution by Germans and Poles alike, of the pogroms and betrayals. Again, it's a memoir that's worth reading. It's called Against the Wind. Rofe's astonishing account is an important piece of evidence that adds to the many other accounts that show how British POWs were brought face to face with the fate of Jews caught up in the Nazi maelstrom. These Jews took their experiences with them into British post-war life. Their story has permeated the national consciousness at a low level, but crucially they show that significant details about the treatment of Jews under Nazi rule were circulating in Britain well before the Holocaust became an overarching narrative. POW accounts were an important vessel for transmitting the fate of European Jews to a potentially wide audience, and that's immediately after the war. Examining these accounts allows for a telling insight into what they understood and how they reacted, and one that is actually much more interesting and challenging than the myths about POWs that circulated after the war and continue to do so. That's me done. Thank you very much. Shall I come this way?
Sorry, we'll just do a bit of musical chairs for...
Oh, sorry, I meant to...
To be frank, I'm not sure that the publishers have entirely priced it in the most accessible way, but it is a great book. So we'll now have time for questions, and obviously we've got a lot of people here, and I'm sure that many of you have questions to ask. If I could take the chair's prerogative, though, and go first, sorry. I just thought, Russell, it might be interesting for the audience to know a little bit more about the sources that you were using in carrying out the study.
Right, yeah. Can you hear still? Yeah, okay. I spent a lot of time down at the Imperial War Museum. There were largely two places. There was the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives down at Kew. The Imperial War Museum allowed me to access the individual records of POWs, or their accounts or unpublished accounts, and even diaries and things like letters and postcards that POWs had sent home, or diaries. There was one guy, for example, who kept a diary even though he was in the small fortress at Theresienstadt, which I think was a remarkable achievement. So, you know, he said something along the lines of, he was recounting the death of a Jew that he could just see out of the window in the yard, and he said something along the lines of, if you don't believe me, there is a Jew now that's just being wheeled away, you know, having been killed by the guards. And you get that kind of sense of immediacy about it. And so what I tried to do was I tried to privilege those kind of accounts, the ones that were closest to events, rather than the ones that had been, you know, forged in the years after, when the more heroic element of the retelling of the war kind of appeared. The other place that I spent time in was Kew, and down there there are reports, for example, from the Red Cross of what conditions were like in the various work detachments. There's one for June, I think it's June or July 1944 for E715, which is provides a very useful picture of what life was like for the POWs there. And there's also the war crimes trials documentation, which is vast, absolutely vast. I mean, I'm working on other projects at the moment that are kind of linked to. I mean, I went down there, and it was like there was a huge, you know, array of sources, and I thought, crumbs, there must be about 50 books to be written here. But it's one of those labour-intensive things, you know. So if anybody wants a research project, nip down to Kew, type in war crimes trials, and, you know, hey presto. There's also, I mean, obviously at the Wiener, you've got a whole load of stuff from the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which is a valuable source. I think it comes from Dan Plesch, doesn't it? Is that right? I can't remember. I think it's Dan Plesch. Anyway, so that's largely where I got my stuff from.
So we expect books by this time next year from all of you. Any questions there? Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
I first came across Charles Coward in a little thin book that was published by Yad Vashem called Roll of Honor, and it was, you know, it was like some of the very early people who were recognised among the artists among the nations, and this was when I started to do work with children.
Right.
And what I wanted to ask was, because I know that later on they were very rigorous. I mean, before a tree would